The pot of red sealing wax sat at the corner of Lady Bramford's writing desk, small and ordinary and precise as a sin kept in plain sight. Cecily Warren had looked at it every morning for 4 months without understanding what it meant. She understood it now, standing at the edge of the room with a tray of correspondence balanced against her hip, and the winter light coming through the tall Georgian windows in that particular Bath quality she had come to know as grey and forgiving of nothing. He arrived on a Thursday, which was the day the drawing room was arranged for callers, and Cecily's position required her to be invisible. She was not invisible to him. Edmund Ashcroft, Viscount Carow, was announced at 11:30. He entered the way a man who has spent years in charge of rooms enters them, without adjustment, without scan. He handed his coat to the footman and crossed to Lady Bramford with the briefness of obligation. And then he turned, because something had arrested him, and his eyes found Cecily Warren at her place near the window, before she had time to look away. He was 33 years old, and built with a kind of compressed force that his stillness made more apparent rather than less. A long face with a faint scar at the left cheekbone. Deep-set gray eyes that did not soften. A mouth that was level and considered, and gave nothing of what it considered. His dark navy tailcoat was perfectly fitted at the shoulder, and he stood as though he were carved into the posture, not trained into it. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. Lady Bramford said his name, and the moment closed. Cecily lowered her eyes to the correspondence in her hands, and felt her pulse at the base of her throat, which was perfectly absurd, and which told her nothing she was willing to know. That evening, when the candles were being lit and the last caller had gone, Dorothea came to her in the passage outside the linen room. The maid was 52 years old, and had served in the Bramford household for a decade longer than Cecily had been alive, and she never sought Cecily out without a reason. She stood close, and spoke in a voice below the level of the house's ordinary sounds. "You ought to know, miss," Dorothea said, "that Lord Carow was told you refused his household's offer." Cecily held the linen she was carrying and waited. A position was arranged. Governess to his ward, the little girl his sister left. A letter was sent in your name. A refusal. "I wrote no refusal," Cecily said. Dorothea's small round eyes did not waver. "No, miss, you did not." She turned and went back toward the kitchen stairs without another word, and Cecily stood in the passage for a long moment, with the cold linen folded between her hands and a feeling she could not yet name beginning to take its shape beneath her breastbone. She had been at Lady Bramford's for 4 months. She had come from her father's house in Dorset after his death in September, carrying a recommendation from the vicar and a trunk of plain gowns and nothing else. Her mother had gone when Cecily was 7 years old and had not returned. And the lesson of that departure had been absorbed early and without ceremony. She was not the kind of woman people stayed for. She had built her life with that understanding as its foundation. She expected no choosing. She had learned to make herself useful instead. Lady Bramford was a woman of 58 who had been widowed for 12 years, and who ran her household and her social circle with the specific competence of a general who has never had to take the field. She wore diamonds to breakfast and kept her opinions in the room at all times. To her circle she described Cecily as her companion. In private, she treated her as a woman who was fortunate to be useful. "She has no family to speak of and no money at all." Lady Bramford had explained to Mrs. Halford in Cecily's hearing on the 3rd day, "A woman without roots, which makes her grateful, and grateful women are dependable." She had said it pleasantly, the way one discusses the predictable behavior of weather. And Cecily had continued arranging the morning mail without alteration of expression. She was accustomed to being described correctly about the wrong things. What she had not known, until Dorothea's words in the passage, was that she had been answered for. That someone had opened her mouth and spoken from it without her knowledge or consent. If you are still finding your way into this story, stay a little longer. Some debts are older than anyone admits, and the truth has been waiting in the most patient of hands. She did not sleep well that Thursday. Lord Carow was in Bath for a legal matter concerning the Carow Estate Trust, and he had taken rooms at the York Hotel and intended to stay a fortnight. This information came through Dorothea on Friday morning, folded into the delivery of her usual tasks as though it were simply weather. He called again on Saturday, and on Tuesday. Each call was formally addressed to Lady Bramford, and Lady Bramford received him with the particular pleasure of a woman who understood the social currency of a viscount in her drawing-room. Cecily served the tea both times, and said nothing beyond what was required, and kept her hands entirely steady, which cost her more than anyone present would have estimated. He did not speak to her directly on Saturday. On Tuesday he said, when Lady Bramford had stepped to the window to address the footman about a carriage matter, "You have been in Bath 4 months, I understand." "Yes, my lord." "And before that, Dorset?" "Yes." "I knew a solicitor named Warren in Dorset," he said. "His daughter." "He was my father," Cecily said. "He died in September." There was a pause that was not an absence of sound, but an arrangement of it, and when she looked up from the tea she was pouring, she found he was watching her with an expression she could not read at all. His gray eyes, still and without warmth, but not without attention, which was a different thing. "I am sorry," he said. The words were level and carried no decoration, and she believed them. She handed him his tea. His gloved fingers did not quite touch hers, and she was aware of it with a specificity that had no rational source. The nearness of his hand, the inch of air between them, the fact that his breathing had altered by some fraction, she felt, rather than heard. "Thank you," he said, which was for the tea. He looked at her a moment longer, and then Lady Bramford returned. Her body knew things. Her mind refused to examine. He was 6 inches taller than she was, and the room changed its proportions when he was in it, not through any action on his part, but through the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of something under constraint, rather than the stillness of something at rest. She found herself aware of exactly where he stood without looking. She found herself monitoring the direction of his attention from the periphery of her own. She arranged her expression with the care of a woman who has had considerable practice at concealment and was not at all certain it was working. She thought with the wry corner of her that she kept most private, that this was precisely the sort of man you did not allow yourself to think about. She thought about him regardless. On the second call she had very nearly dropped the tea service. "Went? Oh." She had turned from the side table with the full tray and found him directly behind her. Not deliberately. He had simply moved to allow Lady Bramford's cat access to the settee, and had crossed into the space she was crossing, and she checked herself sharply, and the cups rattled and his hand came up and steadied the tray from the side. His fingers closing briefly over the edge, and then his other hand was at her arm just below the elbow, steadying her rather than the tray, and he did not release immediately. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. She said, "Thank you, my lord," in a voice that was entirely appropriate to the occasion. He said nothing. He removed his hand and stepped back, and she crossed to Lady Bramford and set the tray down with complete precision. She did not look at him for the next quarter hour. When she did look, he was watching the window, his profile clean against the gray winter light from the street, and she thought with a clarity she had not invited that his face was the kind of face a woman remembered without intending to, specific and unposed and carrying its history in the particular arrangement of its bones, the scar at his cheekbone, the set of his mouth, which was serious without being cold, though she had spent 3 Tuesdays believing it was cold, and was only now beginning to understand the difference. He was there when she went to read to Clara. Clara was 15 months old, and belonged to Lord Caro's household, in the abstract sense that small children belong to households when they are very young, and their mother is dead, and their father was never named. Louisa Ashcroft had died 11 days after the child's birth, 18 months prior, and the infant had been taken in by Edmund's aunt, Lady Portman, who had come to Bath for her health and brought Clara with her, and Cecily had learned of the child's existence because Dorothea had mentioned it. And Cecily had mentioned to Lady Portman's housekeeper that she was skilled with young children, and 2 afternoons a week she was permitted to read to Clara in Lady Portman's front parlor. She did not know he would be there. She had been reading for perhaps 20 minutes, the small child leaning against her with the particular heavy trust of a child who is nearly asleep, when she felt the change in the room and looked toward the doorway and found him there. He had not knocked. He was standing in the doorway of his aunt's parlor with his coat still on and his hat in his hand. and he was watching her read to Louisa's daughter, and his face had done something that he had not intended it to do. The discipline across it had slipped, not in the way of a man who has lost control, but in the way of a man who has seen something for which his control was not prepared. He did not come in. He stood there for the time it took her to read another page, and then he turned and walked quietly away, and Cecily turned the next page and kept reading, and Clara put her small hand over Cecily's and did not know what she had witnessed. Later, much later, Dorothea made her decision. She found Edmund in the small library of the York Hotel. She had asked for him at the desk in the way of a woman who has decided on something and is not prepared to be redirected. She stood before him with her hands folded and told him what she had seen 18 months before. Reginald Bramford, at his mother's writing desk, copying the slope of Edmund's signature from a genuine letter, sealing the forgery with the same red wax, the letter declining to come to Louisa. The letter that had kept him in London while his sister was dying. Edmund listened without moving. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain, my lord," Dorothea said. "I have been certain for 18 months. I was afraid." She paused. "I am still afraid." Miss Warren did not write that refusal. "And you are here in the same city, and it seemed to me that the time for being afraid was passing." He asked her nothing more. She left, and he stood at the narrow library window, looking out at the wet stone street below, and he understood for the first time that the grief he had been carrying for Louisa was not deserved in the way he had thought. He had not abandoned her. He had been kept from her. Those were not the same. The understanding arrived, not as comfort, but as something colder, a precise revision of a wound that had organized itself around a false fact. The sealing wax. The same pot, the same brass handle. He had known the Bramfords all his life. He had not known what they were capable of doing, with a clear morning and no witnesses. There was a third letter, of a kind. The draft of the forgery which Reginald had discarded in the fireplace grate, but had not quite burned, had been removed by Dorothea and pressed flat and kept in the pages of her Bible. She had not mentioned it to Edmund. She was saving it for the moment it would matter most. Reginald Bramford arrived in Bath on Thursday, a week after his first appearance in the story, and he arrived with the particular confidence of a man who has never had a secret catch-up with him and does not yet know his luck has turned. He was 31 and handsome, in the way of men who have always been told so, with his mother's social ease and his father's coloring, and none of either parent's intelligence. He called on his mother that evening and learned that Lord Carow had been a regular caller, and his face performed a brief, private calculation that Lady Bramford did not observe. At the card evening she hosted 2 days later he found his opportunity. Cecily was present in the capacity of companion, meaning she stood near enough to be useful and far enough from the table to be decorative. Reginald took his place at the table, and in the way of men who use public spaces as weapons, spoke pleasantly and at a volume the room could hear. "I understand Miss Warren has made herself rather invaluable to the Carow household's little girl," he said to his neighbor at the table. "Ambitious women often find their angle quickly, do they not? A woman without roots knows the value of attaching herself to a stable trunk before the season changes." Several heads turned. Several more made the careful decision not to turn. The quality of the silence was specific and knowing. The silence of a room that has heard something and has not yet decided how to weight it. Lady Bramford touched her cards and did not look at her son, and did not correct him. Cicely stood at the edge of the room and felt the temperature of her face, and kept it still, and counted the seconds until the evening ended. Lord Carow was not present. He had not been invited. Cecily understood, on the walk home through the cold Bath streets, that this was not an accident. Mrs. Du. Halford appeared at Lady Bramford's on Friday morning, before the usual calling hour, with the bright urgency of a woman carrying news she has been told to carry. "My dear," she said to Lady Bramford, "I have heard the most distressing things, that Miss Warren has been telling people some sort of story about your household. Something about letters." She did not lower her voice sufficiently. Cecily heard it from the corridor where she was carrying a basket of mending. "A woman without roots," Lady Bramford said, and her voice was measured and sorrowing, "will sometimes construct a history she finds preferable to the one she has. It is to be expected. One is charitable about it." Mrs. Halford left, and Lady Bramford came into the corridor and found Cecily standing with the mending basket. And what passed between them needed no words. Lady Bramford's expression said it plainly. Cecily was useful so long as she was silent. Her usefulness had a very specific ceiling, and the ceiling was now visible to both of them. That night, Dorothea came to Cecily's room. She told her everything. The full account. Both letters. Reginald at the desk with the red wax and the brass seal, Lady Bramford herself 3 days later, writing Cecily's refusal, in a hand that was close enough to pass at a distance. Dorothea's own silence carried for 18 months out of fear of the street, and the cold, and the absence of any other roof. "I have kept something," Dorothea said. She described the draft, the fire grate, the Bible. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has chosen her moment and knows the choosing will cost her. "Does he know?" Cecily asked. "Lord Carrow. Does he know about the draft?" "No, miss." "Not yet." Cecily sat with this for a long time. Outside her window, the rain moved against the glass, and the fire had gone low, and the room was very quiet. Lady Bramford had been listening at the corridor. She always listened at corridors. In the morning, she came to Cecily before breakfast, and told her in the pleasant voice she used for pronouncing final things, that a companion who spread vicious stories about her employer's family would find no character forthcoming. That a woman who arrived with nothing and fabricated resentments would leave with less than nothing. That the position at Carrow House had been refused because Cecily herself was unsuitable, and the letter had reflected nothing but that truth, even if the letter had required a small adjustment to present it clearly. She said the word adjustment with the serenity of someone who does not expect to be contradicted. Cecily went to her room and began packing her trunk. She had £2 and some shillings. She had her father's last letter, written in September when he was already very ill, when his hand was unsteady at the pen, but his sentences were still clear and careful. She had a plain gown and a dark wool mantle, and a small volume of poetry her father had given her at her confirmation. She had the small wax pot that had lived on his writing desk for as long as she could remember, cream-colored, half-used, which she had kept because she could not bring herself to leave it behind in a house that would not be hers after October. She had nowhere to go. She folded the gowns in the way she had learned to fold them when there was no maid to do it, neat and flat and without sentiment. She did not cry, because she had learned very early that crying arranged nothing, and she did not have the hours to spare for it. She packed her father's letter and the poetry on top, where they would not be crushed, and she fastened the trunk clasps and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the gray morning light and considered what came next. Lady Bramford was going to win. This was simply the arrangement of the facts. A woman with a household and diamonds and 30 years of social authority against a woman with a trunk and £2 and no character forthcoming. The hierarchy had always worked this way, and would go on working this way. And Cecily had known it since she was 7 years old and watching her mother walk down a lane in Dorset, and the knowing had never made it less true. She was not going to ask Lord Carrow for anything. She had said that to herself quite clearly, in the specific voice she used when she was attempting to believe something. And then she thought of Dorothea in that corridor, 20 years of service, and a draft of a letter in a Bible, choosing the moment when the cost of silence finally exceeded the cost of speaking. She thought of Clara in the parlor, one small hand laid over hers without any understanding of what it offered. She thought of gray eyes that had not looked away. She closed the trunk and put on her mantle and went to find him. He was at the York Hotel in the small library, which was where, she was beginning to understand, he went when he was thinking through something he could not resolve with ordinary tools. She asked for him at the desk in the same manner as Dorothea had, and the clerk who looked at her seemed to weigh the question for a moment, and then sent a boy upstairs. He came down himself rather than send a message. He looked at her in the doorway of the library with an expression that was very controlled and very attentive, and he said, "Miss Warren, I am leaving Lady Bramford's house today," Cecily said. "I wanted to tell you certain things before I go. I have no proof of most of them. I am telling you because I believe you are owed the truth, not because I expect anything to follow from it." She told him about Dorothea's account. She told him about Reginald and Louisa. She named it plainly, without softening, because she had learned that the truth is not softened by the softening of it. She told him about the draft in the Bible. She told him about the letter in her name and the red sealing wax. She said all of it in a voice that was steady, and when she was done, she stood and waited. He had gone entirely still during the telling. Not the stillness of a man who is unmoved, but the stillness of a man who has learned to hold very large things inside a very small surface. His gray eyes were on her face, and they had not moved. "You came here to tell me this," he said, "knowing you had no proof." "Dorothea has the draft," Cecily said. "I could not take it with me. I did not think it was mine to take. You are leaving." "I am leaving." "Where?" he said. "Are you going?" "I have not entirely resolved that," Cecily said, and something in his face moved fractionally, a small controlled thing that in another man might have been called an expression. He crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the library and wrote 2 lines on a card and sealed it with the hotel's plain ink stamp and put it in her hand. "Take this to my aunt's house, Lady Portman. Tell her I sent you. She will not turn you away." He paused. "Clara is fond of you." "I know," Cecily said. He was standing very close to her. The light from the library's single tall window came from the left and fell across the scar at his cheekbone, and the dark, serious line of his brow, and she was aware of his breathing as a specific fact, the faint warmth of it in the cool library air, the nearness of his hand at his side, and the 2 inches between that hand and the edge of her mantle. She had not come here for this. She was not certain what this was. "Cecily," he said. She looked up. "I came to your employer's house 4 times, he said, and his voice was low and level and entirely without performance. "I came once for the legal matter. I came the other times because I could not stop thinking about the woman I found reading to my sister's daughter as though she had always belonged in that chair. I came because your face was the first thing in a year that I could not persuade myself to stop looking at. I am telling you this not as a claim on anything. I am telling you because you came here to give me the truth, and I find I cannot let you walk out with less than the same." She felt her chest tighten with something that had no clean name. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides, which cost her a great deal. "You barely know me," she said. "I know what I have watched," he said. She thought of Dorothea's Bible. She thought of the red wax on the desk. She thought of her mother walking away on an autumn morning when Cecily was 7 years old and the door closing in a house she had not been able to stop calling home for years after she left it. "I do not know yet what follows from this," she said carefully. "No," he said, "nor do I." A pause. "But I intend to find out." He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she could have taken 1 step and closed the distance between them, and she did not, and he did not. And the held moment between them was the truest conversation they had yet had. The invitation to Lady Bramford's morning call on Saturday had gone out on Thursday, before Lady Bramford understood how the week was going to resolve. By Friday evening she did not know how to withdraw it without consequence, and so the room was full at 10:30. Mrs. Halford and her niece had arrived first, then a colonel's wife from Belmont, then 2 young women from the Bath Assembly Circuit, and Reginald stood at the far end with a cup of coffee, and the studied ease of a man who believes he has correctly anticipated the direction of the wind. Mr. Tewkesbury, Edmund's solicitor, arrived at 11:15, and was not on the invitation list. Edmund arrived at 11. Reginald's face went through something swift and private when Edmund entered. The room reordered itself around the arrival, as rooms do when a man of his rank and manner enters them, and Lady Bramford performed a welcome that was only slightly thinner than usual, because she was a woman who understood that the morning could still be managed. Dorothea had given Edmund the draft that morning. It was a single folded sheet, worn at the creases from 18 months in a Bible's spine. With Reginald's handwriting, in the attempt at Edmund's slope, the ink slightly thicker at the letters where he had been uncertain, the erasure of one word visible at the end of the second line. Small, specific, irrefutable. Mr. Tewkesbury received it from Edmund and crossed to the writing desk and laid it open on the surface. Beside the red wax pot, which sat there as it always sat, small and ordinary and patient, Reginald watched from his position near the far wall, and the color left his face in the way of water leaving a glass. Steadily and all at once Edmund spoke, without raising his voice. He addressed the room in the measured tones of a man who does not require the room's permission for what he is about to say. He named the letter that had kept him from his sister. He named the letter that had declined the governess position in Cecily's name. He said, with the economy of a man who has earned his words, that the household at the center of both forgeries had been using sealed correspondence as a currency of control for some years, and that the sealing wax on the desk would, upon examination, match the impression on both letters which were in Mr. Tewkesbury's keeping. He paused. Miss Warren refused nothing, he said. Every word in that letter was a lie. The room was very quiet. The colonel's wife was looking at the writing desk with an expression that was careful and horrified. Halford had lowered her coffee. Lady Bramford sat at the center of the room, with her fan held at the measured height it was always held, and her face performing the composure she had performed for 30 years. And something behind it, beneath the performance, was recognizing the weight of the morning. Reginald said, "That is not my hand," and the words arrived too quickly and without the steadiness they needed, and 3 people in the room could hear the difference. Dorothea said from the doorway, "It is, sir." She did not move from the door. She said it in the voice of a woman who has spent 20 years in service and has weighed exactly what a word costs and has decided to spend it. "I saw you write it. I saw the scratching out at the end. I remember what you scratched." She named the word. It was the word endure, which Reginald had written, and then removed because it had sounded too much like himself, and not enough like Edmund Ashcroft. The room was in possession of itself, only barely. Reginald set down his cup. The sound of it on the saucer was the loudest thing in the room. Lady Bramford looked at her son, and what crossed her face was not the composure she had spent 30 years perfecting, but something older and smaller beneath it, the face of a woman who has believed her script would work everywhere, and has arrived at the place where it has not. She pressed her fan flat against her palm. She said nothing. The morning call did not continue much longer after that. There were procedural matters that Mr. Tewkesbury managed with the quiet efficiency of a man who has managed difficult rooms before. There were forms to be signed and arrangements to be named. Reginald left early, which was the correct decision, and Lady Bramford's face rearranged itself back toward its customary performance, though the performance wore differently now, like a gown that has been re-washed and will not quite hang the same. Mrs. Halford was the last to go. At the door, she paused and looked back at the writing desk where the draft still lay open, and she looked at the red wax pot beside it, and she pressed her lips together and left without speaking. Cecily was not in the room. She was at Lady Portman's house, 2 streets away, sitting with Clara, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, with the complete trust of a child who does not know yet that trust can be misplaced. The fire was lit, and the room was warm, and the winter light through the tall windows was that particular bath quality, soft and without harshness. And Cecily had closed her book and was simply present in the moment with the sleeping child, and the fire and the quiet. Prasset. Edmund arrived at noon. He did not announce himself. Lady Portman's footman showed him to the parlor, and he stood in the doorway as he had stood in this doorway once before, and he looked at Cecily with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and his expression did not perform itself this time. She looked up. "It is done," he said. She let out a breath that she had not known she was holding. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her, not close enough to disturb Clara, and they spoke in low voices for a long time. The kind of conversation that assembles itself slowly from all the conversations that could not be had before it. He told her about Louisa. The real account, not the arranged one. She told him about her father's house in Dorset, the morning she arrived at Lady Bramford's, with her trunk and her £2, what she had believed about herself for most of her adult life, because her mother had walked away, and no one had ever explained it in terms that made her the correct version of the story. He listened with a quality of attention that was different from patience. It was the attention of a man who is taking in specific facts because the specific facts matter to him. "You thought no one would choose you," he said. "I had rather a lot of evidence," Cecily said. "The evidence was arranged," he said. Clara stirred between them and settled again, and Cecily felt the small, warm weight of her, and the warmth from the fire, and the quality of the afternoon, which had become quite still. "I want to ask you something," Edmund said, "and I want you to understand that the answer does not change your situation here. Lady Portman is glad of your company, and Clara is better for it, and you are welcome in this house, regardless of what you say." "Yes," Cecily said. "Will you allow me to call on you properly?" he said. "With the understanding that I intend to resolve this in the direction I have already named." She looked at him across the sleeping child. His gray eyes were level and serious, and the scar at his cheekbone caught the firelight. And he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the drawing-room on the first Thursday, before the room reasserted its arrangements, with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. She thought of what it had cost him to say it, a man of his restraint and his reserve. "Yes," she said, "I will allow it." Clara's hand curled in her sleep around a fold of Cecily's sage-green gown, and Edmund exhaled. And the fire settled in the grate, and the afternoon held itself quietly around them. The engagement was formalized in December. 2 weeks before Christmas, in Lady Portman's parlour with Mr. Tewkesbury present, and 2 witnesses, and very little ceremony beyond what the law required. Edmund signed the papers and handed the pen to Cecily, and she held it for a moment before she wrote, because she had spent considerable years managing a life in which her name was not consulted before it was used, and she wanted to feel this. She signed. He put his hand over hers when she set the pen down. His fingers were warm through her glove, and he did not release immediately, and she looked up at him and found him looking back, and his expression was, for the first time, entirely undisciplined. "Cecily," he said quietly, "for her alone." She did not trust her voice. She turned her hand and pressed it once against his palm, which said, she thought, what needed to be said. Dorothea was given a position in the Carow household, which was what she had feared to hope for, and she arrived in Bath Street on the Tuesday after Christmas, with her Bible in her plain grey dress and her 30 years of kept secrets, the last of which she had finally spent. By the first week of the new year, the city had rotated on to its next arrangement. Lady Bramford's morning calls were less attended than they had been. Reginald had gone to his uncle in the north. The season would carry its verdict forward, as seasons do, quietly and without mercy, in the manner of all the machinery that had always pressed on people with nothing to hold it. Cecily sat at the small writing desk in the corner of Lady Portman's front parlour on the evening of the 6th of January, the night before she and Edmund were to travel to the Carow estate for the first time. The room smelled of candle wax and the pine boughs Lady Portman had kept past the holiday, and Clara was asleep in the nursery above, and the house was very quiet. Edmund had left an hour earlier. He had come to go over the arrangements for the morning, carriages and trunks and the order of things, and when the business was finished he had remained in the chair across from her for a time, without any particular reason that he stated. He had looked at the fire. She had looked at the letter she was composing. They had been very comfortable in the silence, which was a thing she had not expected to find with a man who said so little. Before he left, he had stood in the doorway and looked at her at the desk in the candlelight and said, "You should know that the Carow Library has rather more volumes than you have likely been told." "How many?" she said. "Enough," he said. "That a person who reads well and reads often would not exhaust it in a reasonable number of years." She had kept her expression entirely neutral. "That seems a practical consideration." "Yes," he said. "I thought you would appreciate it." And then in the quieter voice, the one he used when he was not performing containment, "I will see you in the morning, Cecily." She had looked at the door after he closed it for rather a long time. She had her own wax now, cream-colored, in the small pot her father had kept on his desk in Dorset, which had come in the bottom of her trunk, along with a volume of poetry and his last letter. She melted it carefully over the candle, and pressed the seal, and the impression it left was clean and even and entirely her own. The letter was to her father's old friend in Dorset, a retired solicitor named Graves, who had written her in October with worry, and whom she had been meaning to reassure since November. She told him she was going to a place that had been waiting for her without knowing she was coming. She told him that Clara's first tooth had appeared last Tuesday, and that Cecily had been the one holding her when it did, and that the child had looked up at her afterward with an expression of considerable self-satisfaction that Cecily found privately to be the correct response to any small victory. She told him that she was going to be happy. She had not planned to write that sentence. She sat for a moment after she had written it, reading it back in the warm, unsteady light, and found that it was simply true, and that the truth of it did not frighten her as much as she had expected. She sealed the letter and held it for a moment, and then set it beside the candle. The fire was burning steadily in the hearth. Through the tall, dark window, the first snow of the year had begun, soft and without hurry, falling on the gray bathstone in a quiet that had no opinion about who deserved it. The cream wax on the sealed letter caught the light, and Cecily sat for a long while in the warm stillness of a house she had been welcomed into, in a chair that was hers, at a desk where her own things were arranged. She had not expected to be here. She had expected for most of her life to endure, to be useful and quiet and take up the minimum of space that decency required. She had expected to fold herself into the shape of whatever room would have her, and be grateful for the room. She had not expected someone to look at her across a drawing room and find her worth looking for. She picked up the sealed letter, and the light was warm, and outside the window the snow fell without hurry on everything. On the gray stone and the dark pavements and the plain and the ornamented alike, and did not distinguish between them. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments below. Some truths wait a long time for the right hands to carry them out into the light.